Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our policy discussion panel, and big thank you for all the speakers who kindly agreed to join us today, connecting from, in fact, 3 different continents, if I'm correct. Today's conversation is taking place within the larger Governing the Green Transition discussion series. And today I'm particularly glad to welcome the conversation on the roles of finance ministries and steering green transitions in climate action. Today's conversation is taking place amid the background of discussions about fiscal and debt sustainability, post-COVID recovery, investment-led growth, not only in Europe, but also worldwide. In other words, finance ministries are the focal points for not only economic governance, but increasingly climate action, as there are multiple economic and financial levers to enable climate policies. At the international arena, the global forum, the Global Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action was formed in 2018, which now consists of close to 80 members, and its member countries together account for more than 65% of global GDP and some 40% of global carbon emission. We'll hear more about coalition's work in a second. Before that, let me introduce the speakers. First, we will hear more about the work of the coalition and its work, which is built around Helsinki principles, with Finland also being a co-chair, from Pekka Moren. Pekka Moren, since 2020, the special representative of Finance Minister on climate action, acting full-time as a co-chair of the coalition and as the minister's deputy, Sherpa. Pekka is also representing since 2016 Finland at the Nordic Investment Bank as member of the board. Previously, Pekka was the director of international financial affairs and the director in charge of euro area stability at the finance ministry. Prior to this, he was special advisor on EU financial stability and crisis management issues during early stages of the financial crisis. He also served as economist in the European Commission, Secretariat of ECOFIN Committee, Economic Policy Committee, and Eurogroup. Welcome, Pekka. Next, Annika Högwolf will introduce the forthcoming landmark report of the coalition that has a focus on core climate-related functions and capabilities of finance ministries. Annika is a policy analyst working on climate action and international finance. She coordinates the Grantham Research Institute's engagement with the coalition. Prior to joining the Grantham Institute at LSE, Annika was a senior policy officer at the environmental disclosure charity CDP, supporting policy engagement with the UK government and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Welcome, Annika. Nick Godfrey is a senior advisor for the Grantham Research Institute at LSE as well, Annika's colleague, helping to lead Research Institute's work to support the coalition, including supporting Professor Lord Stern and Amar Bhattacharya, who are advisors to our coalition's co-chairs. Nick has over 15 years experience working at the nexus of international development and climate action. Nick was previously a member of the executive team of the New Climate Economy and has led a range of major initiatives in the economic development and climate space, including Guyana's National Competitiveness Strategy, Department for International Development Financial Education Fund, a cross-wide review of the UK's Avoided Deforestation Programme, among others. At this point, I must also extend to thank particularly Annika, but of course also Nick, for co-organizing today's discussion panel with me. Carola Morena Valenzuela is connecting from Chile. Welcome. Carola Morena is the head of finance and international affairs unit at the Ministry of Finance, Chile. Previously, she was interim head of the international relations unit at the central bank and advisor to the division manager of financial policy at the institute. From 2017 to 2020, she worked as Chile's representative to the IMF and as an advisor to the director of the Southern Cone Office for the IMF Executive Board. And last but obviously not least, Thierry Watrin is the Green Economy and Climate Change Advisor to the Minister of State in charge of economic planning in Rwanda. In this capacity, Thierry contributes to the strategic development of a national green economy, specifically working on the transition to a decarbonized, sustainable, and socially responsible economy in Rwanda. Thierry has more than 10 years of experience across finance and energy, working on cross-cutting perspectives to green economy and bringing skills from high-level public and private sectors. Welcome, everyone. Truly delighted to see you all tonight here. And before we learn more about the work of finance ministries in Finland, Chile, and Rwanda, let's hear more about the coalition, a truly global forum, from Pekka Moren. Pekka, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introductions, Olga. The coalition was established for the reason that it became clear that climate change is going to be such a massive effort. It will require such an effort that no one country can do it alone. And that's why scaling up activities together was the plan, bringing together institutional partners with a lot of knowledge. We have 26 of them. And by the way, we now have already 84 countries. We have acquired more members recently, and we expect to reach 100 this year. The high number of membership reflects this need. I think finance ministries are in the need of mainstreaming climate into policies. Otherwise, the accuracy of the economic projections and other tools that we use, budgeting, taxation, will lose sight. We are needed. We need to be integrated in the climate activities. Chile was our founding member. We started the co-chair the coalition. That's why it's good to have Carola there. We together worked on the first 2 years, and now we're co-chairing with Indonesia. The Netherlands will step in this year to replace Finland when our final 4th year comes to an end in the coming weeks. We base our activities on Helsinki principles. There are 6 principles. 2 of them are for us as a given. They are the Paris alignment objectives and the NDCs, where decisions are being taken elsewhere. So we don't set any climate objectives, but our job is to see that the other principles, 3, carbon pricing, 4, economic policy context and public finances, and the financing is aligned with those objectives. So it's a lot of work. They are big work areas, but I think we are quite well set to do that. It's a lot of work. The more we work, we understand also how big an effort that's going to be. Many thought when we started this work that we are called in, and this also came from the COP discussions, that finance ministries are needed because they have pockets full of money. But this is not the reason why we are there. We don't share any money for so easily. So I think the reason why we're there, we are driving the systemic change that will actually make money flow. It will be taken into account in economic policy decisions and transformed into financial system reforms, the systemic change that will actually change the way the economies are working. But that's it in a nutshell. And final word about the guide, the guide that you will be hearing more. It's the most important deliverable of the coalition this year. The guide was actually initiated. The idea came 2 years ago when it became clear that in fact finance ministries, I'm talking broadly here, there was a lot of misunderstanding or lack of awareness what this all means, and that's why we got the idea to start working on the guide. And I'm really grateful that Nick Stern's troops, Nick Godfrey and Annika here, have been really dedicating some time and effort and gathering a very big number of stakeholders and finance ministries to actually do work on it in a kind of a inclusive and comprehensive manner. So that's you're going to hear more about that. But with that, I would just like to thank for the invitation. It's really good to see some of the leading members also joining this panel. So thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Pekka. Annika, the floor is yours. Annika will now introduce the forthcoming landmark report, indeed, the key work of the coalition for this year on core functions of finance ministries and related capabilities. And that work has been led and coordinated by the Grantham Institute. Annika, let me share the slides. Give me a second.
You can leave the slides for now, Olga. I'll talk a little bit first, and then the slide can come in halfway through.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Olga, and thank you, Pekka, also for providing the introduction to the coalition and the report. Yeah, as Olga mentioned, I just want to spend the next 10 minutes or so just giving you a brief overview of this forthcoming report titled Strengthening the Role of Finance Ministers in Driving Climate Action, that's produced really for and with the Coalition of Finance Ministers, and that provides the backdrop for this event today. So just to share a little bit more background on the report, while Nick and I are here today to present the report, I really want to emphasize that this has been a massive collaborative effort with really four groups of people who have been involved in shaping this report, which I really want to acknowledge at this point. So we have of course the team at Grantham, with lots of advice from Nick Stern and Amar Bhattacharya. We have our country steering group, which is made up of over 15 members of the Coalition of Finance Ministers, including the 3 who are present here today. And we have an expert advisory group, and we've also had a number of other experts who reviewed the report, including those who responded to a global consultation that we launched last year at COP. So now on to the report itself. The report really, kind of building up on what Pekka says, has 2 main purposes. A, it wants to really make the case for strengthening the role of finance ministries in driving climate action. And B, it wants to provide some practical guidance on how to mainstream climate action into the operations of finance ministries. And I just want to spend a couple minutes really on both of these issues to provide some context for the panel discussion. So starting with the case for strengthening the role of finance ministries for climate action. I don't think I need to explain to anyone here that we are in a climate crisis and that there still is a massive gap between what is needed to address this crisis and what is currently being done. And just to give one figure, based on current policies, we are on track to a 2.7 degree world. And that's assuming that these current plans are implemented. So we have a lot of work to do. Where do finance ministries come into this picture? So we argue that on the one hand, climate action is absolutely essential for ministries of finance to achieve their core objectives. So around macro stability, around growth, around sustainably managing public finances. And we specifically argue that climate action will bring 4 benefits to finance ministries. It'll help provide cheap, secure, and clean energy and fight inflation. It'll help avoid massive risks on the economy and the budget and governments more broadly. It'll help unlock a number of growth and development benefits and savings for the public purse. Think, for instance, job generation, lower health costs because of cleaner air, etc. And specifically investing in resilience will unlock the so-called triple resilience dividend with benefits for the economy, society, and environment. And on the other hand, not only is climate action key for ministries of finance, but finance ministries are also really essential for successful climate action, which is, of course, why the coalition exists. And we argue that ministries of finance hold a number of significant levers to really accelerate climate action. And just to give a couple of examples, finance ministries are often called center of government bodies that are really influential in coordinating economic and tax policy. So they're really key for setting the policies and the right environment for mobilizing the investment or for making the money flow, as Pekka said earlier, that's needed to tackle climate change. And climate change is, of course, about really economy-wide transformation that goes beyond the remit of individual line ministries. And finance ministries often have an overview of a country's entire economy and therefore a big role in shaping national vision, strategies, plans, and also on climate. And then, of course, through the budget, finance ministries oversee the expenditure of all government departments, which gives them direct or indirect control over 1/3 of global GDP, which can be used to tackle climate change. And last but not least, finance ministries are often regulators or shareholders in different entities like state-owned enterprises, national development banks, multilateral development banks, central banks, lots of banks. So they can play a big role in working with these institutions and greening these institutions as well. So in short, ministries of finance are absolutely crucial for a whole of government approach to climate action. But while we are seeing a lot of action from finance ministries in the coalition and beyond, and our three panelists will later tell us surely many things they are driving in their countries, the picture that we're seeing overall is one of many finance ministries not quite stepping up to the challenge yet. So for instance, we see finance ministries continuing to provide fossil fuel subsidies. We see finance ministries not quite properly involved yet in NDC formulation, for instance, nationally determined contributions and implementation. And we also found, for instance, that only 20 or roughly 20 finance ministries worldwide have an organizational strategy that tackles climate change or mentions climate change in their internal strategy. So there really is a need for ministries of finance to kind of consistently step up their game and holistically mainstream climate into their functions and capabilities. But what does that actually mean, mainstreaming climate action? What is the role of ministries of finance in driving climate action? And this is kind of what we're trying to answer with the second part of this report. And we started off by asking ourselves three questions. Firstly, what are actually ministries of finance's responsibilities? What are the capabilities they need to perform these responsibilities, and how can these be greened? And Olga, if you can share your slide now, because what we landed on is what we call this Ministry of Finance framework for climate action. And which is really kind of the meat of the report. I'm not seeing the slide yet. I don't know if you're, there we go. Excellent. So yeah, this framework is really the meat of the report, or as a vegetarian, I should probably say the tofu of the report, and consisting of three functions based on the responsibilities that a typical finance ministry has, and three capabilities that it needs to perform these functions. And Pekka earlier mentioned the six Helsinki principles. And if you look at the little dots in the corner, you can kind of see they're all somewhere in there. So one idea of the framework is also just really to bring all these six principles under one roof. But yeah, I just want to briefly talk you through each of these functions and capabilities. So in the functions, we have the first one, which is around economic strategy and vision. So this is really about how ministries of finance can contribute to national climate strategies like NDCs, like long-term strategies, but also national adaptation plans, and then embed these at the heart of their national development planning, their investment strategies, their budget planning processes, etc. Then function two, fiscal policy, is where it really gets to the heart of the Ministry of Finance work. So this covers two main areas, the tax side and the budget side. So on the tax side, for instance, it covers things like how can ministries of finance use fiscal policy levers, so carbon pricing, subsidy reform, but also other environmental taxes and fiscal incentives to drive climate action. And then on the budget side, well, what is the role of the budget, but also the role of public investment management or public procurement. And then function three is all about financing the transition. So how can ministries of finance draw on public, on private, on domestic, on international capital to make the money flow? Really covering a wider range of topics, from working with the private sector, working with central banks, to working, as mentioned before, with greening state-owned enterprises, disaster risk finance, etc. Then, of course, we have the three capabilities. We have the leadership capability, which is around ensuring that climate change is mainstreamed across the operations of the ministry. For instance, making sure that the ministry has an explicit mandate on climate change, if it needs one, has an organizational strategy that includes climate, and an institutional setup, for instance, a climate unit that can help coordinate and drive the work on climate. Then the second capability is around collaboration and coordination, both with government and beyond. It's really ensuring that ministries of finance are part of a whole of government approach to climate action. And then we have the human analytical capability. And this is about how they can make sure they have the right expertise, staff and skills, and also the right economic decision-making tools and data to drive all of these processes. And then last but not least, we have one cross-cutting theme at the very bottom, the just transition. We basically argue there can be no transition without a just transition. So it really needs to be mainstreamed into all policy design, both to ensure public support, but also policies that are long-lasting and effective. So that's our framework. In the report, we then dive deep into these different functions and capabilities And we have a range of kind of action areas, so further split the function capabilities into different sections, and talk about what finance ministries, what their role is in these areas, what typical challenges are they might have to overcome. And we provide lots of case studies from all over the world of countries that are already working, or finance ministries that are already working on these specific things. And then we finish off with a section how ministries of finance can start to implement the framework and really start going on further strengthening their functions and capabilities. And I think I'll leave it here. Just one thing to add is that while the report will formally be launched in April, there is a draft version that's already available online. And I'll try and share that link with you for those of you who are interested. And with that, back to Olga. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annika. So the report will be launched in spring, fairly soon. We are already in spring, but sometime in the coming weeks. And that will be also on the Coalition website, right? That's the main communication channel. Thanks a lot. Well, now I would like to invite other speakers to introduce their own roles in their respective finance ministries. And it's amazing that you are joining us from different regions and parts of the world. So hopefully we can also have that comparative perspective based on your commentaries and your contributions today. So I would like to perhaps spend the next 10 minutes if each of you could outline your role in your respective finance ministries, as well as outline perhaps major or more recent climate related work streams in the ministries that you work in. Perhaps Carola, may I invite you to come in first?
Thank you very much, Olga. Good afternoon to everyone, and hi to Pekka, Annika, Thierry, Nick, to everyone that's listening us. So you made a very nice introduction. Head of Financial and International Affairs at the Ministry of Finance. And in this division that I'm leading, head of the Green Finance Office. This is an office that has, I have the pleasure to say, one more person as of now, so 3 people dedicated full-time, and we also have part-time people working on financing and international issues as well. So that complements or basically gives you a big picture. We are from this office and from the Ministry of Finance promoting institutionality, regulatory and normative frameworks. Just to give an example, we are working on developing a green taxonomy right now. Green taxes also being, we already have one. We are improving the mechanism. We coordinate different shareholders from this office, public sector, private sector, and also, of course, with the international institutions and exchanges like the ones we're having right now. We basically establish roles at the local level, responsibilities, and we try to support the development of a shared vision. As I mentioned, we follow, we lead international relations in terms of green finance, and we want to follow green best practices and also position Chile in the international arena. And last but not least, of course, we're in charge of financing issues, and also we channel funds from, let's say, the Green Climate Fund, but we also work on leveraging from the private sector and giving that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Carola. Thierry, may I ask you to come in and introduce your Rwanda context?
Sure. Thank you, Olga. So my name is Thierry Watrin. I'm the Green Economy Advisor to the Minister of State in charge of economic planning. So basically, the main role of the position and the department is to develop a green economy at a country level. And by green economy, we mean a decarbonized economy, a sustainable economy, and a socially responsible economy. And trickling down from this very big mandate, we are working on different work streams, like greening our public sector management, mobilizing climate finance, of course, because you need money, right, to finance your very beautiful green projects. And last but not least, the policies. And Annika was talking about that. And it's part of our discussion, the coalition of finance ministers. Yes, that's basically it.
Thank you. Pekka, would you like to say a few words about Finland experience?
Yeah. Finland was the first country to take on carbon tax on 1990. So I would say on taxation, we are in a good place. We have good experts, a lot of tradition, and on a lot of things we are learning. And one big driver in the European Union, a member country, is the European Union, because they keep coming with a lot of ideas where we need to respond. And greening the financial system is one example. Taxonomy, we negotiate that with among the European members. It needs to be mentioned when we are members of the European Union. But my personal, I mean, maybe the hot topic now in Finland, we are going to elections in 1 month's time. So it's really about how the mainstreaming role of economic financial policies will be feed into the new government program. We have very good political sort of ambitious climate objective, 2035 carbon neutrality. So there is a political consensus. We don't have that problem. But the most recent, most important issues that in the finance ministry, we adopted climate and nature strategy in December. It's available on the website if you Google climate and nature strategy, finance ministry of Finland. So that's, I think we've been working on it. Now we're working on how to actually then implement that. So, but my job right now, I'm reporting directly to the minister, but as part of also strategy, the strategy that I mentioned, I think one important element is that there is a link to the international work and the coalition. So our aim is to suck all the information and knowledge from the coalition activities to the finance ministry and learn and develop our activities based on best practices. That's why the coalition is there, and that's what we're trying to. It's an important element of our strategy.
Thank you. Nick, would you like to come in as well and perhaps share your perspective? What do you see emerging, for example, in the Climate Action International Development Nexus, or any other perspectives?
Yeah, thank you, Olga. I mean, I guess the perspective I'd like to share is very much coming back to what Annika mentioned. So if you look globally where we are on climate, we need to get to a net zero global economy by mid-century. That's going to require significant transformation in all of the key sectors of the economy, in transport, in energy, in buildings, in industry, and that will require significant investment. Yes, the investment needs are significant, but they will deliver significant economic and social dividends. The investment gap is quite enormous. So at the moment, we're spending globally on climate action around $600 billion. That needs to be closer to $4 trillion per annum for the next decade and beyond to stand any chance of hitting net zero by mid-century. Now, what I would say is that the global debate to date, certainly in the last 10 years, has placed a lot of emphasis on the role of private finance with initiatives like GFANZ, the role of central banks through efforts like NGFS, and the role of international climate finance. And of course, these three areas are really enormously important. What I think is that we need to place an equal, if not greater, emphasis on the role of finance ministries in driving this investment and creating the enabling policies for driving and unlocking that investment at scale from all these different sources. So I think the role of finance ministries needs to be given greater prominence and emphasis. So that'd just be my kind of first point. I guess my second point is that the good news is we're already seeing extraordinary leadership by finance ministries, and we have 3 incredible leaders here: Finland, Rwanda, Chile. What I would say is that if we look at the past and the present, you know, finance ministries have the experience to be the global leaders that we need to see. So if we look at the past, finance ministries have always been at the heart of tackling the immense global challenges of the day. Finance ministries were right at the heart of driving economic transformation in the post-war era. If you look at the East Asian tiger economies, finance ministries have worked very closely with all elements of government to drive economic transformation and financing at scale. Finance ministries are very well equipped as crisis managers. We've seen that in their role in helping support coming out of the global financial crisis, huge innovation in responding to the COVID pandemic. And so I think finance ministries, if we look at the past, have the experience and the qualities as crisis managers and drivers of economic transformation to bring similar qualities to bear to tackle the climate crisis. So that's the past. In the present, we're seeing significant leadership. So, you know, Jamaica has just developed an enormously path-breaking disaster risk finance strategy. We've seen Uruguay's Ministry of Finance right at the heart of helping Uruguay invest in a renewable energy transition, close to 100% renewable energy now in Uruguay. Ireland has its Ministry of Finance has helped design a carbon pricing scheme that's linked revenues to the just transition. And in Denmark, we've seen the Ministry of Finance update its entire mandate to put sustainable development and climate action right at the heart of it. So enormous leadership. What I would say is that there are barriers to action, and a lot of the solutions to overcoming those is indeed building the capabilities across the 3 areas that Annika mentioned: leadership, collaboration, analytical, and staffing capability. But I have every confidence that ministries of finance are up to the task, and we see 3 amazing leaders here, which are testimony to that.
Thank you very much, Nick, also for bringing the historical perspective and on the question of economic transformation. So I hope that we can also perhaps talk about climate action in that sense tonight as well. Let me go to the more detailed question to our dear speakers, and perhaps let me start with a broader, almost like a helicopter view. And the question I prepared first is, when referring to the role of finance ministries in climate action, often the whole of government approach is mentioned. I mean, it was already mentioned now, and or let's say what Danica called the systems approach, for example. What role your Ministry of Finance plays, or what tools it deploys in enabling this whole of government approach? What are also key allies, partners, strategic partners, other public agencies, for example, or teams, or internal government teams? And what are the main challenges to implementing this approach? You may also touch on the question of climate mandate, if relevant. Carola, may I invite you to come in with that?
Okay, thank you, Olga. So it's complicated to be brief, but I'll make an effort. For us, it's very important that we provide from the Ministry of Finance certainty, transparency, use the regulatory and normative standards as a common good, which it is, but we are very engaged with the civil society and also the private sector in order to make this public good as useful, as objective as possible, so that we create these certainties that I was saying. We feel that on this ground, we can also promote cooperation among public institutions. We coordinate a lot of interministerial committees Some of them we lead, some of them we are the secretariat, but we are always very involved, of course, in the topics that have to do with financing, but also, as I mentioned, in terms of course, revenues in the side of green taxes, and also always trying to follow and learn from other countries on best practices. And that's why for us it's very important to be part of this coalition. So I mean, not to go one by one, of course, of the things that we do at the Ministry of Finance, but our main allies, as you mentioned, are of course the Ministry of Environment, with whom we work a lot in terms of implementing the measures that come out of the long-term climate strategy. We are focused on developing and improving the financial long-term strategy that the country has. And in this regard, we also work a lot with the Ministry of Energy, which they are more concentrated, of course, in strategies for production and consumption of energy, but we work a lot with them. The Budget Office, of course, that's one of our allies, even though we're in the same building. And we work a lot with other financial, let's say, agencies like the Corfo, which is it's an institution that enhances a private sector activity, and we are very, very engaged in developing a green hydrogen industry. So with the Ministry of Energy and this institution that I was mentioning, Corfo, we work very, very closely, and with 11 other ministries. So this is a government strategy, and more than that, like a state strategy. We want it to be something that goes well beyond one particular administration. That would say that would be a nutshell, not in a nutshell, what we do and who are our allies.
If I just may also follow up on the challenges, because I mean,
I'm sorry. We have challenges, I would say, basically in terms of human resources, I would say, building capacity. We are a group that was formed, I would say, a couple of years ago. We know that the priorities on green finance arena, it's growing by the second. So we need to build more capacity in that regard. At the whole, as you say, government level, I think we need to prioritize maybe, and as you know, changing priorities. This is something that it's happening, I mean, all over the world, not just in Chile. So we need to work on that and defining more the roles. And that is a big challenge from the Ministry of Finance in order to be able to better coordinate all the agencies. I would say that and more on a technical level, building more data and information. So we're very engaged also with our international partners in participating in fora that will allow us to move forward and build on that gap that I think everyone has, but it's a challenge for us as well.
Thank you. Pekka, would you like to come in?
Indeed. Thank you very much. Very similar issues on challenges. I would say on challenges, before I go broader into the whole government, that really important to ensure and understanding and awareness of what climate change means for the finance ministry. We should not underestimate this, because if you don't have that understanding, it's really difficult to get anything developed, because that's the basis. And then how you bring those issues into the governance on the whole. Then moving to the whole government approach, it's a bit mixed. Currently, for example, there's a ministerial group on climate action or climate policy. And for example, finance ministry is not sitting on that group. which kind of tells a story that our role is a bit, finance ministry's role is not so self-evident, but the leadership of that is with the environment ministry. Maybe one reason for that is that we are in charge of the budget and taxation. So when the finance ministry comes to these tables, they are sitting as chairs or not at all. This is just my own kind of a perspective. So there are these governance issues. And I can say, because I've been talking to about 50, 60 members and visiting many countries, the number one challenge that everybody raises normally is I would say almost everybody raises internal governance issues. And these are also issues that people feel a bit uncomfortable speaking up loud. But the kind of whole government approach, there are two things that need to be separated. One could think that because finance ministries are in charge of budgets and taxation, budget covers a lot of issues, many sectors, all the sectors, that there we have the whole government approach, but that's not the way it goes. I give an example. In Finland, by law, the finance ministry's tasks are it's a long list. We have 14 very fundamental tasks that are really critical from the climate perspective. These include procurement policy principles, developing the tax system, public finances management as a whole. Then in Finland, we have a very broad responsibility on the administration of public sector. What does it mean? It means that, for example, finance ministry is designing, guiding, directing the public sector real estate policy, for example. That's quite a big relevant issue when it comes to climate policies. And then we guide, under our direction is 26 different agencies. They are big agencies, and many of them. And then on the top of that, many like international financial institutions. So there's a lot to guide. And if you don't have the expertise and knowledge on what kind of directions you give them on climate issues, then I mean there is a risk that you become a drag or a bottleneck in the process. So I think it's good that these issues are all now it's on the agenda, and in many fronts these are taking into account in the guidance. But I think it just shows that there is so much to do when it comes to the whole government approach, because that's really broad. And there are many countries who are actually on it. There are just a couple of countries who are actually basically, you could say that they are comprehensively, enforcing this approach. But that's, I think, we know what to do, and what it means.
Thank you. Thierry, would you like to come in, share Rwanda perspective?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Olga. Well, I'll share the Rwandan and the African perspective because I believe I'm the only Africa representative. So I will introduce the context for Rwanda and Africa. We have experienced the COVID-19 pandemic, the global inflation, the global supply chain disruptions, like most of the countries in the world. That was followed by the ongoing war in Ukraine that has had a drastic impact on the commodity markets, disrupting production and trade, pushing the prices of food, oil, and gas to records high. On the Africa side, the African economies, they are massively affected by climate's impact and by all these external shocks. According to the Climate Policy Institute, the total annual climate finance flows in Africa is only 30 billion. And the needed climate finance in Africa is 277 billion. So it means that we fulfill only 11% on the climate needs. Another consequence is that African countries will be obliged to further borrow to mitigate the climate impacts that are already causing their economy. On the specific case of Rwanda, which is BTW less than 0.003% of global GHG emission, we have consequences on climate which are quite similar to other East African countries, but as well to other equatorial countries. And according to the country climate development reports, we'll have higher temperatures. You have that in most of the countries in the world. In Rwanda, it will be more variable rainfalls and more drought. It will have a direct damage to assets, land, people, capital, and productivity. For example, labor or agricultural yields. And we're already seeing this global inflation, especially the price rise in agriculture. And the impact on the economy is this food inflation and the GDP loss, which could be between 1 to 5% by 2050, lower exports, lower consumption, and fiscal risk, pure climate fiscal risk. So it completely changes the structure of our economy. First, on the topic of the role of finance ministry in climate action, which is the topic of the debate today. Or the panel, I don't know if we can speak about a debate. We need an approach to be fit for purpose. So it means that we basically need to break it down. First, the local capacity. I think Nick and Annika were rightfully talking about it. That's an issue. That's an issue in smaller country, but that's as well an issue in middle income country. And the Prime Minister, Maya Mottley from Barbados was actually talking about that a few weeks ago. And there's a sense of inequality versus advanced countries, which have de facto greater education framework capacity as well. So imagine when you're a smaller and developing country, it's even more difficult to access the skills needed to tackle these new external shocks that are interlinked at the same time and hitting your economy. From the paper of the Grantham Research Institute from Pekka and presented by Pekka and by Annika and Nick, 3 capabilities: leadership, coordination, human and analytical capabilities. First, I think it's interesting because it's part of the discussion that we have not only with Nick and Annika, but as well with the Coalition of Finance Ministers, and it's part of Helsinki Principle 2. And as well, it intersects with the last book of Mariana Mazzucato on the necessity, I'm sure you all have read it or heard about it, on the necessity to build internal capacities in our ministries to achieve this green transition. And I like the expression of positive bureaucracy to innovate and to internally tackle the new economic global shocks. Secondly, there is the nexus that all the ministries of finance have between climate finance, debt management, and climate policies. My colleague from Chile was briefly talking about it. There are some easy wins and examples that we can do to stop, for example, the vicious circles for developing and middle income countries. The ministries of finance could assess differently climate-related debt expenditures to the one that harm the environment in their debt sustainability analysis. We're talking about fiscal space. That's an example that would totally change the game. Another one is pricing carbon. And I believe Pekka was talking about that for Finland. As well, the ministries of finance can reinvent themselves to tackle climate change into the 2 typical core functions that are present and presented in the report of the Graham Institute. The first one is the strategic vision. So the Ministry of Finance is in charge of this programmatic approach of strategies. We can mainstream climate into national strategies, development, and sector plans. Rwanda has been doing it for a long time, and climate is actually mainstreamed into all the green, into all the high-level strategies. So you have the national program NST1, You have the Vision 2050, which wants Rwanda to be carbon neutral by 2050. You have another example, I think, from Bangladesh, aiming in 2050 to be carbon negative. So that shows you how powerful those agenda can be. In an innovative way, in the strategic vision, Rwanda is developing a cross-cutting programmatic approach, which is moving from the orthodox project financing to a program vision, integrating climate change, trickling down to external finance mobilization. And so concretely, what it means is that we're talking with our partners to finance climate change through a programmatic approach, which can be defined as a set of interlinked projects unified by an overarching vision to deliver climate results at scale. So really, the goal is to use a program, brings scalability, gain time for everybody, fix the 1-2000 climate finance gap. Nick was talking about the trillions needed, but we receive only billions. And in Rwanda, we need billions, but we receive only millions. And as well, this programmatic approach brings flexibility. The second mandate, and I will stop there, on mobilizing finance and putting the relevant fiscal policies. We need to challenge the one-size-fits-for-all prescription in global climate finance. That's a statement. So it's easy for those who proposes it usually, but for those who receive it, it does not take into account the specificities. For example, on debt for nature swap, you cannot compare countries like Belize, a small Caribbean country, which struck 10% of the GDP using the climate for debt swap, to Brazil or a country like Ghana, Zambia, which is 10 times bigger, CCC rated, and having this debt relief through the common framework. And then you have Rwanda, in the same continent, which is having a very sustainable debt with an average of 6.7% only interest amount to GDP, and that is under the other B+ rated peers. Currently, the conditions to access the market are not concessional enough to tackle climate finance globally. We need more fiscal space to achieve this MPV neutral climate agenda. So I could speak about 3 innovative instruments that we're currently pushing and that we'll be discussing in the Paris Macron Summit in next June. Non-debt instruments, local currency solutions, carbon credits, or AAA guarantees. It's really to use efficiently and rethink the multiplier effect of gains. Another thing is that Rwanda has been accessing this IMF and Resilient Sustainability Trust to really use this climate policy-based financing. So it's a 319 million highly concessional funding that will advance the effort of building resilience against climate change. Why is it interesting? Because the IMF has understood a core issue that we're having in ministries of finance of developing and some middle-income country. The concept behind that is the fiscal space discrepancy. Concrete example, and I'll end up there, the education. You finance education with 10 to 15 years maturity. However, when you create value, the value created into a child that goes to school and then graduates and then come back possibly in your ministry to work is more than 30 years. So you have a fiscal space discrepancy that's created and the fiscal burden is taken by the states, right? And I think that's interesting as well, Olga, because it raises one of the questions of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. What is the public value? How can we reinvent the public value? And so currently the state are taking on it, and it's something that we really need to tackle.
Yes, thank you, Terry. Nick, would you like to come in perhaps with a comment on bottlenecks and challenges, what you observe from your work? And then we move to the next round.
Sure. I mean, we've had a real privilege of spending a lot of time in the last year with many finance ministries as part of this process. And I think three barriers really stand out for me, which don't necessarily apply to all finance ministries, but I think apply to a good number. So I think the first barrier that we've encountered is really the framing that many finance ministries look at the climate question and look at the climate action. So I think far too many finance ministries, which doesn't include the three on this call, see climate action as really a risk and cost to be managed rather than a unique growth and investment opportunity. So focus very much on risk and cost management rather than benefit and opportunity. And I think, we're increasingly seeing, the enormous benefits that can come from countries being at the frontier of investment in the new economy. So that's the first kind of barrier. How do we encourage finance ministries to think of climate action less as a cost and a risk to be managed and much more about unlocking enormous benefits and opportunities for citizens and businesses? The second key challenge, I think, is many finance ministries, quite rightly, are very concerned if they act more aggressively on climate, what this will do to the tax base. So, for example, as countries electrify transportation, what's going to happen to vehicle duty? They're very concerned about this. But there's two factors that have to be emphasized. One, electrification is already happening and is inevitable. Second, there are an extremely large number of opportunities that finance ministry can look at to diversify the tax base. So, for example, you can look at, rather than traditional vehicle taxes, you can tax based on distance rather than on the type of fuel used. You can implement congestion charging. You can do all kinds of different measures related to encouraging investment in sustainable transportation with reform to land and property taxation, as well as, of course, you can look at reforming the tax base more broadly. But so that's the kind of second issue around concern about the tax base. The third issue, I think, is really, I think many finance ministries traditionally have had quite a conservative approach to climate policy. So there's been quite a significant fixation on pricing the externality via instruments such as carbon pricing, subsidy reform. This is very much a kind of static set of measures, which are enormously important, absolutely enormously important instruments to help tackle the externality related to carbon emissions. At the same time, though, I think what we're increasingly appreciating is actually climate action is a dynamic story. It's about the phase down and the phase out of certain sectors and the phase up and growth of new sectors. This dynamic story requires a supplementary range of climate policies to help catalyze the industries of the future. This is why I think the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the EU are increasingly looking at how do we look at fiscal subsidies and fiscal incentives to galvanize net zero industry and create the economies and industries of the future. So I think, these are three significant barriers that I think need to be tackled. I think the good news is that we've outlined in this guide some of the ways that we think finance ministries can think about these issues and build capabilities to address those challenges. So, for example, doing broad-based reviews of compatibility of the tax system with net zero, looking out to the medium and long term and looking at alternative revenue streams, and on framing the climate question as less of a trade-off framing and much more of a win-win and synergistic framing, on looking at new approaches to economic modeling and looking at a more diverse range of climate policies to supplement carbon pricing and subsidy reform. So I think there's a lot that can be done. My only final remark I wanted to mention is one of the big barriers that we also see, maybe a fourth one, is many finance ministries perhaps feel that they might be concerned about encroaching on the territory of other ministries. I think what I would say is that what we've attempted to do in this guide is to really articulate very clearly that this is a story of partnership and a story of finance ministries enabling and empowering others. And what we've tried to do is really break down the responsibilities of finance ministries into 3 key buckets. So bucket 1 is, which are the areas which are simply the core responsibility of a finance ministry that no one else can do, no other government department can do. The second bucket is, which are the key areas that require shared ownership and shared leadership with other line ministries? And the third bucket is, which are the areas which are around supporting and enabling leadership by other key line ministries? And what we've tried to do is therefore kind of break down this kind of polarized debate, which is, some finance ministries, it's not our problem. It's the kind of agenda of other government departments, or the opposite, which is, we don't want to get involved because we don't want to tread on toes. And we've tried to really kind of find a way through that by articulating where these partnership opportunities are really important. Maybe I'll leave it there, Olga.
Thank you, Nick. Well, you mentioned the industries of the future, and of course at IPP we also talk about innovation and governance of innovation. We also talk about bureaucracy. So all of these issues are hugely important. And I would like maybe to pick up on the industries and to maybe move on to my next question, which is about economic strategy, or understood in a broader terms, the economic strategy that also has sectoral technology innovation policies in it. And if we take that approach of a structural transformation, Ministry of Finance role in it. And my question would be then, how can Ministry of Finance best work with other ministries, other agencies, other stakeholders to go forward with it at the pace and scale that we all need? What are the, again, key allies? How it's coordinated? What are challenges? We may also include some international partners. Maybe Thierry, you would like to touch on them. Let's say Rwanda's experience with the IMF Resilience Trust, or what about also combining long-term, forward-looking technological trajectories that we need to account for with the more short and medium-term, let's say, budgetary frameworks, because the Ministry of Finance perhaps should also work with the different multiple timelines. So a lot of issues. You may pick or comment on any of those. Carola, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you, Olga. So you mentioned something really important in terms of the overall economy. For us, it's really important to educate and to act as there is no trade-off between growth and the green transition. And this is something I think globally everybody is struggling, as it wasn't the rule of the game or the common knowledge as of now. So all our strategy, of course, is at the country level. We're trying to go beyond as administrations. And in that regard, we need to work together, right? So we have this new enacted law, which is a framework law on climate change. And from there, we're building a long-term strategy, which gives a mandate to the Ministry of Finance in terms of having a financial strategy. So we need everyone there, of course, and we need also long-term plans to implement. So for us, what Nick was mentioning in terms of having flexibility and working in this dynamic environment has to be combined with a coordinated work with other ministries, which in our case, it's formalized through some committees. We have, for instance, just to name the Green Hydrogen Development Committee for developing, the green hydrogen industry, which is at the presidential level, organized by 11 ministries, and we all work together with the same vision. So that's one concrete example. We work as, let's say, informal partners with the central bank. The central bank, in our case, is completely autonomous. So in matters that has to do with their mandate, they collaborate with us. For them, it's very important, for instance, to have information. We are working now on something that goes beyond with the current guide. It's on natural capital. So we are working all together on that. But they also advise us, again, with respect in the limits that they have in terms of their mandate, for instance, in the development of the basic structural elements for the taxonomy. Just to mention that our long-term view basically is it's constructed upon political will, but leadership and concrete action, as I was saying. We need transparent and credible rules of the game. And so we're working again with different sectors and with the financial sector through public-private roundtable that we have in coordination with all the private sector. And also working on creating incentives and disincentives together with the Ministry of Environment, for instance, Ministry of Energy, who work with us in terms of designing a structure for taxation that is actually effective and efficient. And just to close, accountability. That's very important in terms of public policy, but also on the side of the private sector.
Thank you. Particularly thanks for touching on the link with the central bank. Perhaps we can also address it in the Q&A later on. But Pekka, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, building on the excellent experiences from Chile, just a few points. I think the last point on accountability is really important because in Finland, I was listing those all tasks that link to have clear important links to the making progress in climate policies. But Finland, we are lacking a concrete mandate. Like in the UK, there is a climate act. Because that involves accountability, and accountability. If you have accountability, then you need to have resources and expertise. So everything is behind a concrete mandate. Then governance is really important. We are currently considering how to actually do that. Hopefully politicians will give also direction on it after the elections that are around the corner. But we have last year we established a working group which was mandated by the finance minister, environment minister, and the Minister of Economy and Labor. So the kind of three key ministries. There is, by the way, a report that is now just being translated in English as well. So that's that's available also on the website. That's important because we looked really into, and there was also in the chat, Derek Eaton posted a question about the industrial policy. That's exactly what we are also talking about. I mean, you need to understand what goes on more broadly in the economy, and then see what are the different sort of ways to address it. You need a comprehensive strategy. One last example, it has to do with subsidies, and there is a link to not only industrial policy but also, I mean, the whole economy when it comes to subsidies. There is and Annika raised it in the introduction. There is no panel discussion where we come to these subsidies, and I think what is important to recognize that they're extremely difficult to take out because all the you need to integrate a plan in a bit more long-term strategy because they're embedded in the system. They've been taken on board during many centuries, and it's not like you just take them on and off every year when you feel that or assess that something is harmful or not serving the right purpose. Their impacts are very difficult to see. They could be tax exemptions, like in Finnish case, more than half of these subsidies are. There are 200 tax exemptions, which are really, you know, deep rooted. Also, some of them into the system. So you cannot just take them on and out. You know, So my point is that you need really comprehensive strategies. You need to work together. You need to think also the governance of all these beyond the political cycles. That's important. That's really important also. And of course, different countries have different systems. In some countries, politics change the administration and the leadership. There could be big changes, and there are countries where it's more stable and so forth. So, but that's what we are trying to also learn. Last point on central banks. When we have had many sort of in the past in Europe, for example, and in the Nordic region banking crisis situations, I think there's a very good and important collaboration with the central banks. That we're also collaborating with the network of central banks at the international level, the coalition, and that's important because they are supposed to be afraid of ghosts. They are supposed to be analyzing risks, what might happen. It's part of their mandate in the context of tasks that they have, even if they are independent. It's really important to have utilize their really strong expertise, and they are investing now in also climate risks and stress testing and all that. So it's important partnership. That's clear.
Thank you very much. I'm mindful of the time. We have slightly less than 20 minutes, so I think I will give the floor to Thierry and Nick to conclude this round, and I will open floor for Q&A because we already have a question from Derek. Nick, would you like to come in from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Derek's question is very interesting around do finance ministries do they recognize how important, industrial and innovation policy could be to drive the transformation we need and the types of policies that might be needed? Well, I don't think so. I think some finance ministries, absolutely. I think many don't necessarily. One of the challenges, I think, is with the economics profession. I think the economics profession, large parts of it haven't really moved on since the neoclassical thinking of the 1980s and early 90s, which very much I think placed a primacy on the role of the private sector to drive change, and less a focus on the deep partnership that's needed between the public and private sector to drive transformation. And I think this has led to a very much an emphasis on market mechanisms to drive the type of investment and change we need to see, and less a focus on non-market or non-pricing mechanisms such as fiscal subsidies or incentives. And I think it leads to a rather unsophisticated debate, which is it's kind of two paradigms or versions of the world, or two types of economic policy. One is quite interventionist, one is less interventionist. I think it's possible to combine the power of both. For example, in the case of mechanisms such as emissions trading schemes, carbon pricing, they can be very easily complemented with other measures to enhance their effectiveness. So, for example, Denmark put in place a whole range of non-pricing measures, fiscal subsidies connected to industrial transformation to lay the foundation for galvanizing a range of low carbon sectors, which then created the alternatives needed when carbon pricing was introduced to enable the economy to transition and to shift in a low carbon trajectory. So combining pricing and non-pricing instruments, or combining kind of heterodox and non-heterodox instruments in economic policy terms. So I think what we have to do is have a much more sophisticated debate around the combination and complementarity of instruments to drive the type of dynamic structural transformation we need to see. So that's what I would say on that point. I do think more attention does need to be given to the design of effective industrial and innovation policy measures. Because of course, putting in place unsustainable fiscal subsidies is not the way forward either. We have to make sure we're learning the lessons of effective incentive design. And there are many lessons that we can learn that can be put in place. I'll leave it there. I did just want to say, I recognise a number of important colleagues on the line that have played a big role in contributing to the work of the Coalition of Finance Ministers and the work that we've been doing with members. So I can see there's Himanshu from the UN family there. We've got Astrid, we've got Patrick. And I just wanted to welcome, actually, I saw Frank van Leuven, who is just about to join the Coalition of Finance Ministers and help galvanise more leadership globally on this agenda. So just wanted to extend a welcome to some friendly faces.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Nick. And Thierry, before we perhaps take on the Derek's question, and Derek is used to be my colleague, I would like to perhaps just to ask you if maybe you would like to share Rwanda experience on tapping into international pools of capital and how to make sure because that's of course a lesson for a lot of developing and developed countries alike, how to make sure that international capital comes in and actually serves domestic purposes.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Olga. I think it's quite a capital one and comes in parallel to the question of Derek. But first, one of the prerequisites is to be able to work as a team and arrive coordinated. So I totally agree with Carola from Chile and Pekka from Finland. It comes back to accountability. In the coordination, you can have those sector working groups, those committees with ministries of environment, central banks, development banks, and the private sector, but you need to have a leading agency at the end. It could be PM, or it could be the prime ministries, or it could be the presidency. On the scaling up of climate finance using those capital pools, something that the IMF has understood and is changing the game is that we need scalable concessional long-term finance. So in itself, the RST, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, is a pure climate finance instrument. But on top of that, it will be scaled up, and we're working on the scaling up currently as we talk. At the origin, how did it came? It was one of the funding proposed by the IMF to help countries to build resilience to external shocks like climate change or pandemics, to ensure a long-term sustainable growth. So you see the alignment I was talking before about the fiscal space discrepancy. You finance long-term issues with long-term financing and at scale. Under this agreement with the IMF, Rwanda will access 319 million USD, which is quite huge and highly concessional finance to advance our efforts in building resilience against climate change. So how has it happened? It was first a testament of Rwanda's strong track record in climate policies and a sustained implementation framework of reforms to address climate change. So the RST is scaling up a few policies. I will not give all the details, but what you need to understand when we talk about the RST is that it's a policy-based solution. So we're receiving climate finance in exchange of policy implementation. Nick was just saying how difficult historically it has been for the ministries of finance to implement it. Well, once you have climate finance that comes and finance your policies, it totally changed the game. And now we're trying to scale it up to finance the private sector as well, because it's a public climate finance. But now we're thinking as Rwanda, how can we scale up those 390 million USD for access to the private sector, for the most vulnerable, and for an equitable and fair transition.
Thank you. Well, I think some of you already touched on Derek's question. Let me just read it perhaps out loud. The investment gap issue presented by the Grantham researchers suggests successful solutions to mobilizing investment have yet to be found. Now that we see the US moving boldly on economic transformation and decarbonization with Inflation Reduction Act, and the EU is drafting the Green Deal industrial plan. So the question is, have finance ministries recognized the key role of industrial policy in such a massive transformation? And perhaps I would add a specific more specific to question, what are the policy tools that finance ministries have today at their discretion to merge the industrial policy goals or decarbonization policy goals from the technological perspective with the all things finance related that they also coordinate? Would anyone like to come in on that? Or what are new policy tools that you think are probable or feasible to be developed in the short run? Pekka?
Yeah, I mean, coming from a country that is a European Union member country, of course, there is a need to collectively also address these kind of issues, and that's been done. But a more general issue when it comes to these kind of matters, I refer to the subsidies, and you know, that's one, of course, important tool, which is also horizontal. Not everything is on the under the thumb of finance ministries, but when it comes to impacts on public finances, use of public money, it's always an issue. But general point that is really important, and it comes to the modeling. If finance ministries cannot, no matter what trade-offs need to be assessed, if you don't have the tools to analyze, assess, then it's ad hoc, and it's really difficult without a framework to analyze impacts. They could be related to broader, like international trade flows, financial flows. They could be whatever policy issues that may have impacts on economy, competitiveness, public finances, and so forth. So everything has a price. So I think the point is, and that's when we are sharing these experiences, we had last week in Helsinki, and this is exactly what we do. I mean, that's the magic of this coalition. We establish bilateral contacts. We have people intensively working together. We had Danish modeling team in Helsinki explaining how they actually, because they are running in front on the way they have actually involved their modeling exercise that started 2016, and the finance ministry got engaged 2019. So it's been going on for almost a decade, and now they are actually integrating that into the policymaking. So that's important. And if you don't have those kind of tools, we know there are a few other countries. We've been comparing, taking stock of different modeling approaches. It's difficult space, it's difficult area, but it needs to be done. Otherwise, we cannot do our jobs.
Carola, would you like to come in with a Chilean perspective?
On our side, I would say that innovations and in terms of how the market works in order to achieve our goals, I would say the most recent is introducing a compensation system in which emitters can buy permits from those that mitigate in order to compensate on their tax base, which is the emissions. And in that regard, we want to motivate basically the appearances of new businesses, let's say, that actually capture emissions more than they issue, or emit. Sorry. In another regard, that it's not really in the sense of industrial policy, as you were mentioning, but for us, a green transition, of course, has to do with changing our energy matrix into more renewables. So I already mentioned the green hydrogen strategy that we're building at the very large scale in terms of public coordination, but I didn't mention that it actually involves a lot of coordination with the private sector, and we have a consultative group composed of different representatives of the main sectors in in the Chilean economy, but also civil society. And so in that regard, that is something that we're working together. But what I wanted to mention is that for us, it's super important to have FDI. And to have a technology transfer from there, and not only the investment itself, but both, complemented with technology transfer. And for that, it's very important that we improve the permitting procedures that we have in order for new businesses to be installed, to start their business, new enterprises to start their business in our country. So that is something that it's very on the top of the agenda, actually embedded on the productivity agenda to boost this type of investment. And we want to study if and how to implement ETS. And that is something that will also have an effect if we move in that direction, which actually our framework law on climate change does tell us that we need to move in that direction. So it's a matter of how and when. And well, by the way, I didn't mention, but we're probably one of the few countries that has the goal in terms of emissions in the law. So we're going there. And for us also, just to close, it's very important on this technology transfer and building capacity, and in order to work towards this common vision but using best practices. It's this type of engagement at the multilateral level and multi-country, as we have in the coalition, and other platforms in which we participate as well.
Thank you, Carola. Thierry, would you like to come in with the final thoughts, reflections? And then Nick, to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Olga. I think the question on the Inflation Reduction Act refers as well to the arbitrage between just transition and competitiveness. Because at the end, when the US arrived with this big policy, 237 billion policies on climate and industries and competitiveness, there was as well the question about the other, right? Because when you produce a battery or an electric vehicle that costs 10K less per piece, then there's a question about Europe. How can they do their own electric vehicles and sell it at a price which will be a 10K superior? And that's why as well the context of the Green Deal Industrial Plan was a response and an alignment to this. And hopefully in the future, South America, maybe through Mercosur or Africa, to the African Union, can scale up this kind of plan to really boost the industrial competitiveness. But it's only one part of the answer of the global climate change.
Thank you, Terry. Nick.
Hi, Olga. I've made some comments in the chat, so I'm not going to say too much more about that, other than the flagship guide that we've coordinated with the Coalition of Finance Ministers says a lot more about the measures and levers finance ministries have to drive industrial and innovation transformations at scale. And I think a lot more can be done to complement more perhaps established or traditional measures. Just want to encourage everyone that's involved in this discussion just to have a look at the guide, because it does lay out in more detail what we think are some of the most important levers, some of which are under exploited, such as the shareholder positions that ministries of finance have in national development banks and sovereign wealth funds to drive climate action. But also it just draws attention that there's a lot going on. There is extraordinary leadership and examples of ministries of finance doing quite amazing things, actually with relatively limited capacity. I did want to just kind of conclude with Thierry's point that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. What we've proposed in this guide is a set of options that finance ministries can consider. And even within those options, diversity of circumstances are really fundamental. But I honestly believe that finance ministries have the experience and the capability to be right at the heart of the transformation we need to see. And that's what we in GRI will continue to support.
Thank you, Nick. We are 2 minutes over time, and I'm aware that we should finish on time, and we do have one more question in the Q&A, but I'm afraid that we leave it for next time. I would really like to extend sincere appreciation to each of you for coming tonight to discuss these things. And of course, at IPP, we take the question of capabilities, public sector capacities also very seriously. And I hope that today was one more reason to think seriously about the work that finance ministries are doing, and how we can further understand, analyze, study it, but also discuss it. Thanks a lot for sharing your experiences, and I hope to continue this conversation in the future. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.